And now, for the third part and the final part in my series of daily uploads in the lead up to ANZAC Day. Today, of course, is ANZAC Day. Well, it's about 1 AM on the 25th. It would have been about this time that the men were still soundly asleep on the transports before they got into the small rowboats and rowed ashore at ANZAC Cove. And I feel like it is fitting, again, to discuss not another victory, but another defeat that brought out the very best in the ANZAC spirit. You may notice something. These 3 videos where I discuss the biscuits at Gallipoli, and later on in the First World War, of course, where I discuss the loss of HMAS Perth, and the following, where I discuss the Fall of Rabaul, I'm not talking about victories. And I'm doing it very intentionally, because it's easy to celebrate a victory. It is much harder to commemorate and celebrate what a defeat can do. But the thing about defeats is they can bring out the very best or the very worst in a people. And in my opinion, nothing encapsulates the ANZAC spirit better than what happens during a defeat. With that said, in January 1942, the situation in Australia looked incredibly bleak. The small nation was all alone and without friends. Sure, the US Navy and the British Navy were our allies, but the US fleet lay battered and smouldering in Pearl Harbor, and to the west the Royal Navy's protection seemed like a distant memory. Japan was coming, and the War Cabinet in Canberra knew without a shadow of a doubt Japan would set her eyes on Australia's territories of the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. It was a foregone conclusion that the fight was coming, and Australia was in no position to meet it. Her best soldiers and airmen were in the Middle East, her ships were woefully outmatched but also abroad. The coming fight was to be against overwhelming odds, with little chance for success. And naturally, with those kind of odds, there was no shortage of men who enlisted when the call went out.
That every human being in this country is now, whether he or she likes it, at the service of the government to work in the defence of Australia.
Now, you may all have heard the name Guadalcanal. It has been immortalised throughout history by the actions of the 1st Marine Division in its brutal land campaign to take the island. But before the Marines came, Australia prepared 2 armies to fight and defend its island possessions across the Coral Sea. One was a regular force, a part of which was called the Lark Force, and it was deployed to Rabaul, in New Britain, to defend the vital port, and the other was a secret army called the Coast Watchers, men who would go behind enemy lines and live in the jungle with native allies, armed only with small arms and a radio, to report on Japanese movements. The initial thought in Canberra, though, was that Japan would continue to focus on forcing British and Americans from the region, giving Australia some more time, and so with this in mind, the Australian garrison at Rabaul was not increased from the initial 1,400 men sent as a part of Lark Force, with other major settlements such as Port Moresby and New Guinea taking precedence. Backing up Lark Force was the pitifully small 24 Squadron, RAAF, armed with 8 domestically produced Wirraway fighters. Effectively, these were trainers, not fighters, forced into frontline service, and Hudson bombers. This was the situation in Rabaul in early January 1942. Starting on the 4th of January 1942, the port came under attack by large numbers of Japanese carrier-based aircraft. These attacks increased in tempo, and the order was given to the commander of 24 Squadron to use all available aircraft to defend the port settlement until finally, having had enough of the stubborn Australians, Japan unleashed 100 modern aircraft against the defenders. When the Coast Watchers reported the raid coming, the RAAF headquarters confirmed the order to defend the port, giving the order to Wing Commander John LaRue, commanding officer of 24 Squadron, to use all available aircraft to break up the coming assault. LaRue gave a simple response to his superiors with a flair for the dramatic, and under no illusion of the way out. He responded in Latin, as a gladiator from Rome, Nos moroti te salamatas. That's probably horrifically wrong, but it translates to, "We who are about to die salute you." The 8 Wirraways took off, and only 3 returned. All that remained of 24 Squadron at the end of this attack was now a single Hudson bomber and 3 woefully outgunned planes. 4 planes, 1,400 men, and arrayed against them was the 4 carriers Kaga, Akagi, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. 7 cruisers, 14 destroyers, and many other ships. The Australians moved out of Rabaul Township and into Blanche Bay, preparing to meet the landing force of 15,000 men. Their job done, the few remaining RAAF pilots withdrew, knowing full well they wouldn't be able to take off from the runway when the cruisers began their shelling. They withdrew not far though to Lae to continue to fight and interdict Japanese shipping with the help of the Coast Watchers. As the last plane left the ground, the airfield was sabotaged, and on the 22nd of January the Japanese fleet landed 5,000 men, sparking a series of desperate actions near the beaches around Simpson Harbour, Carava Bay and Raluna Point, as the Australians attempted to turn back the attack, but the reality was that there were just too many and nowhere near enough ammunition. The Japanese force was so large that if they encountered such issues such as the 3rd Battalion 144th Regiment at Vulcan Beach, they could simply land elsewhere and surround them. Within hours, the airfield had been captured by the Japanese, and the remaining Australian defenders pushed inland were at risk of being cut off and isolated, and so the commander of Lark Force gave the order, every man for himself. There was a slight issue here though, one that really should not have happened. See, only the RAAF had made evacuation plans. In the days that followed the capture of Rabaul, the Japanese began mopping up operations, and starting on the 24th of January, initially Australian soldiers remained at large in the interior of New Britain for many weeks, surrendering only in piecemeal but being met repeatedly when they did so with mass executions. Word soon got around that you couldn't surrender, and the choice was to either fight as a guerrilla or try and escape. But without supplies, their health and military effectiveness declined. Leaflets posted by Japanese patrols or dropped from planes stated in English, "You can neither find food nor way of escape in this island, and you will die of hunger unless you surrender." And over 1,000 Australians were captured or surrendered. For some of the men, this was just not an option they were willing to stomach. The only way they saw out of their situation was escape. But to do that, they would need an angel. And I don't mean that in a hyperbolic sense, they would need a genuine angel. Someone to deliver them from the very jaws of a horrifying death at the end of a bayonet or through fever in the jungle. It just so happened that there was one, not far, and her name was Gladys Baker. And thankfully, I can tell you this next bit in her words verbatim, because in 1942 she sat down with Radio 2FC and told her story. After Japan attacked, when the women and children were being evacuated from New Britain, I asked permission for the administration to remain. I thought maybe there might be use for my medical knowledge, and I thought that my mud ticket, which I gained because of my knowledge of New Britain, might be required. That last Christmas in 1941 at Langar was the closest I could make it, the same as all the others. I arranged the usual sing-sing for the natives, but I doubted if we would ever have another Christmas on Langu for a long time. Almost a week before Christmas, the first of many reconnaissance planes came over. Nearly all of them would come down low and circle the house at Langu. In case of bombing, I made the natives take shelter in the reinforced concrete culverts I had helped them build. Some Zeros came too, with the rising sun glinting on their wings, and I hated the scream as they dived to look at Langu and the plantation anchorages. Just after Christmas I was granted permission to remain in the territories, the last ship carrying women and children gone. As far as I knew, I was the only woman left. On the 19th of January, the natives told me that Prade Point at Rabaul had been bombed, and gave me details of the bombing, which I later found to be accurate. The news came by drums and smoke signals down the mainland of New Britain, and my boys picked it up. It was a clear day, and they had seen the smoke signals on the mainland 64 miles away. The following day, all radio news from Rabaul ceased, and I later learned from the natives that Rabaul had fallen. There was a small steamer anchored at Witu, the Lakatoy, and I tried to persuade the crew to leave for Australia, but they thought the run would be too risky. I'm going to interject here. When she said persuade, I mean this woman walked on board this ship and effectively told them, "You are making the run to Australia with the men aboard. You're not getting a choice." She was very forceful in that regard. On the 24th of January though, I loaded my pinnace, the Langu II, and set out for the mainland to make food dumps, which I was sure we would require later. I was sure if any Australians had escaped from Rabaul, they would make down the coast. Langu II though only had 9 knots and was 27 feet long. I had with me a boat's crew, these were all natives, and we established our dumps along the Aria River. I left a cutter on the mainland with 8 boats' crew, boys from my own plantation, with instructions to return to Witu, where the Lakatoy was, immediately and tell me if they had any news of Australian soldiers. On my return trip on the 14th of February, a seaplane circled my small pinnace and looked about to land. I told the boys what to say in case the Japanese did land and came across to investigate. I hid in the bilge under the after decking. There was a slap as the seaplane landed, and the motors roared as it taxied close. Next I heard footsteps on the deck accompanied by a flood of fluent pidgin. The Japs had boarded us and were questioning the natives. The native boys told one of the two in an answer to his questions that their master had gone to Sydney a long time ago, and that they were going back to the plantation on Witu to pick up a load of workers to take them back to their villages on the mainland. I remember that, strangely enough, I was not frightened of the Japanese. Perhaps that was because of a rat in the bilge that was running about and brushing against my bare leg. I was wearing only shorts and a t-shirt. I bit my lip until blood ran to prevent myself screaming and giving myself away to the Japanese. The Japs seemed satisfied with my boys' explanations, gave them a cigarette and a biscuit each, went back to their plane and took off. And it wasn't a rat after all, it was only some cotton waste. When I came up, my face was covered in black scum and pitch from the decking, and blackened my back. I saw that 3 of the boys had spread a sail over the aft decking and pretended to mend it all the time the Japanese were aboard. This was in an attempt to hide Gladys from the Japanese. I got back to Langu, and 2 days later the cutter returned. The boys told me of 18 Australian soldiers who were at Linga Linga Plantation in Talisea. The Australians, the head boy told me with tears in his eyes, were sick fella masters too much. I immediately loaded the pittis with food and medical supplies. I overloaded dangerously because I had 15 tons by measurement on a 5.5 ton boat, and by midnight on Sunday, with 3 natives and a half-caste girl, Emma, we crossed to Iboki. I found that 18 Australians there, and I met with Assistant District Officer Keith McCarthy. Keith put me in charge of the Iboki camp, and the next morning 5 of the Australians who were well enough left for Cape Gloucester. They were to wait there until the 13 were well enough to travel to join them. They meant to try and get to Finschhaven. I cooked and nursed 13 boys who were sick, and meanwhile Keith McCarthy, with Rod Marsland, went back to Toll Plantation, which was the scene of the Japanese massacre. I nursed the boys for about a week, and then an order came back from McCarthy telling me to send them to Gloucester. I prepared the boys for the trek, and they went by canoe and launch. Finschhafen had fallen before they left for Cape Gloucester, and the 18 boys got to Madang from where they went overland to Moresby, and they did not get to Australia until 2.5 months after I did. With Australians gone from Iboki, I got the pinnace out and sailed up the coast towards Rabaul to see if I could find more troops. I should mention she's sailing into a Japanese armada at this point to find troops off the coast, by herself, with a couple of native allies. A little way up, I saw a boat stranded on a reef, and thought it might have been an enemy boat. I left the pinnace to go up on the coast in charge of the boys, while I returned to Iboki in a canoe. However, that night the boat on the reef got off and came to Iboki. To my relief, it was a mission boat, and they were surprised to find a woman to welcome them. They had on board 35 boys of the 2nd 22nd Battalion in charge of Captain E.S. Apel, who is now a Lieutenant Colonel. Some of them were very sick, and others wounded. A few days later, the pinnace came back with 15 diggers. A Guinea Airways boat brought more. Escapees continued to trickle in until we numbered 191 in all. Some of the boys had lost all their clothes and were wearing lavas, and some of them were bearded. I remember being struck by the number of ginger beards. I worked night and day caring for them and feeding them. In 16 days, I could only catch 13 hours of sleep. 2 of the boys were badly wounded, and one of them, whose name I think was Bill Collins of Cronulla, had been shot up by the at Toll Plantation in the massacre and escaped. After he was captured, he broke away with his hands still tied together. The Japs fired at him and hit him in the shoulder. Another shot went through his wrists and miraculously severed the cord which bound him. They had already taken his boots and he wandered in the bush for 4 days. Brambles and thorns cut his legs badly. He went back to the massacre scene and helped 2 soldiers who had been bayoneted and left for dead up a steep incline to a native house. The Japanese came, set fire to the house, and Collins alone was able to escape. Many of the sick had severe tropical ulcers, and malaria and dysentery had struck many others. The fever cases were more severe than usual because of the poor diet the men had been subjected to. Their systems were craving for salt and sugar. However, whilst in camp we were able to kill a bullock or some goats every day, and with a small helping of rice, tea and jam, helped pick the boys up. Water was a difficulty, and the natives brought us water by canoe from a distance of 12 miles sealed in long lengths of bamboo. On March the 15th, we had a round table conference attended by all army officers and the captains of the boats, of the small Mosquito fleet, which by now was assembled at a bocce. It was finally decided to go with the fleet back to my plantation to see if the steamer which had been there when I left, the Lakatoy, was still sheltering. Early next morning we arrived at Witu, and fortunately the Lakatoy was still there. We put the 6 soldiers in an improvised hospital, while others with natives set to work cutting leaves and small trees to camouflage our tiny fleet. We camouflaged the steamer, a ship by way of 170 tons, by mixing camouflage colours from a combination of red, white, black, grey, blue and yellow paint, which we found on the island. With other soldiers, I went to my plantation, and we killed as much livestock as the ship's refrigerator would hold. I had no time to collect many personal belongings or papers. On the night of the 19th of March, we were all aboard the Lakatoy, and I played poker with some of the men while we were waiting to sail, and I lost 11 pounds. I was holding 4s all the time. Next afternoon, we sailed, and we prayed for luck. I piloted from Witu through the Dampier Straits and dropped anchor at Embroy Island in the Straits on the 21st. Some of the boys went ashore for a wash at the creek, and on the afterdeck we built a place to cook for the troops. The next day we sailed again, past Finschhaven in broad daylight and followed the main Japanese water route past the Gasmata. This is rather a feat considering we had no charts of any description with us, and the Dampier Straits through which we passed is thickly studded with outcrops of reef and is known for tricky tides. With the help of a Papuan native boat crew we managed to get to the Treboyant Islands, where we were able to meet the Labradia, a Papuan government yacht, having previously contacted by teleradio Army and Navy authorities at Port Moresby. After giving us some more medical supplies, they piloted us through the China Straits, and trusted us in luck and providence that we'd meet up with Australia sometime, somehow, still having no charts. We arrived in Cairns on the Saturday the 29th of March. This is a journey of approximately 850 kilometres. The civilians and officers were billeted in hotels and the troops were taken to a camp for the night, where doctors and nurses took charge of them. The next morning, Sunday, a special train was made up, and although I was offered help for the train trip, I preferred to carry on alone. On the journey I made it practice of devoting each hour to a particular carriage, to continue the medical treatment which I had been giving the troops from the start of the evacuation. The Red Cross and Queensland people were marvellous, bringing supplies of food, clothing, and other items to train for the boys. On the following Wednesday I handed over to an Army medical officer at Exhibition Camp in Brisbane. When we started our evacuation, I first weighed 11 stone 5 pounds. When we handed over the troops at Brisbane, although I didn't know it then, I weighed 7 stones and 1 pound. She lost a quarter of her weight during this. In her own words, that is the story of how Gladys Baker, our civilian widower living in the islands, took up the call, not to do the easy thing, but to do the right thing. Her efforts saved this group of men from Lark Force, and in recognition of her work in helping the troops escape, Gladys Baker was later awarded an Order of the British Empire. She would go on to assist the Coast Watchers in fighting off the Japanese. And she attempted to become a spy, but was rejected because of her gender. She was among, though, the first citizens to return to the Rabaul after the war, and sadly, only after a short time back on Langu Plantation, she was stricken by sickness and died. It is said that when she did pass, she was surrounded by her native workers, who she very much adored. She was buried in front of her beloved plantation home, where not too long ago she set out to make history. The spirit of ANZAC, the memory of our soldiers, sailors, airmen and nurses and the whole nation at war, is not just one of boys in khaki. It is the story of a nation and how even on its very knees with the armies of Japan against it, it stood together as one in the face of overwhelming odds. And said no. As time passed, the sting of defeat on Rabaul lessened, as Australian forces inflicted the first ever defeat on Imperial Japan by Western forces during the Second World War, when they charged ashore at Milne Bay. And then not long after, the Australian Army inflicted another major defeat on Japan by holding it at bay on the Kokoda Trail with militia forces. Japan would never set foot on the Australian mainland in force, and I will say this plainly and loudly, it is not because of the US Marines. We were not saved during the Second World War because we were on our knees. It is because of people like LaRue, like Gladys, and like John French who won his VC and gave his life at Milne Bay. The Second World War and victory was a team effort, but when push came to shove, in those early years when we were alone, it was the ANZACs and the Australians who stood up and said no. The only way I can really think to accurately end this little series that I've done in the lead up to Anzac Day is the reading of the Ode. And to do that, who better than a digger?
They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them, lest we forget.